When you picture the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, what do you see? The golden mask of Tutankhamun? The great pyramids of Giza? A civilization that stood unchallenged for millennia? But what if I told you that in its moment of greatest weakness, a broken and chaotic Egypt wasn't saved by one of its own, but conquered by an empire from the south? They marched north along the Nile, not as foreign invaders, but as saviors, protectors of a faith they believed the Egyptians themselves had forgotten. They came from a land of gold and shadow, a kingdom that history tried to erase. They were the kings of Kush, the Black Pharaohs. And this is their story. Our story begins not in the familiar temples of Thebes or Memphis, but far to the south, hundreds of miles beyond the traditional borders of Egypt. Here, the great Nile River carves its path through a land of stark and beautiful contrasts. Burning deserts of red sand give way to fertile black soil along the riverbanks. Rocky outcrops of granite, known as cataracts, churn the powerful river into treacherous rapids, creating natural barriers that have shaped the destiny of empires for thousands of years. This is Nubia. To the ancient Egyptians, it was Ta Seti, the land of the bow, named for its legendary archers whose skill was feared throughout the ancient world. It was also a treasure house, a land rich with gold, ebony, incense, and ivory. For centuries, it was a place of opportunity, a formidable rival, and ultimately, a prize to be conquered. Long before the rise of the pharaohs we are about to meet, this land was home to its own powerful civilization, the Kingdom of Kerma. Emerging around the same time as Egypt's Middle Kingdom, Kerma was a sophisticated urban center, a true powerhouse of African trade and culture. Its people were master potters, creating ceramics so fine and delicate they were like eggshells. They built unique structures of mud brick called defufas, massive temple-like buildings that dominated their capital city. For over 1,000 years, Kerma stood strong, trading with Egypt, sometimes raiding it, and always maintaining its distinct identity. The kings of Kerma were buried on golden beds, surrounded by hundreds of their followers in a lavish and solemn ritual, a testament to their immense power and divine status. They were a force to be reckoned with, a southern giant that watched the pharaohs in the north with a wary and competitive eye. But no earthly power lasts forever. As Egypt entered its glorious and expansionist New Kingdom period, ambitious pharaohs like Thutmose I turned their gaze southward. They saw Nubia not as a trading partner, but as a territory ripe for colonization, a vault of resources needed to fund their magnificent temples and vast armies. The clash of these two civilizations was inevitable. The Egyptian war machine, honed by years of conflict, was relentless. Pharaoh after pharaoh pushed deeper into Nubia, their armies marching past the cataracts, their authority crushing all resistance. By around 1500 BC, the once mighty Kingdom of Kerma was extinguished, its capital was sacked, its temples were torn down, and its legacy was buried beneath the sands. The land of the bow had been broken. Egypt now ruled from the Mediterranean coast to the fourth cataract of the Nile. For the next 500 years, Nubia would be a colony, a province administered by an Egyptian official known as the Viceroy of Kush. The gold that once built a Nubian kingdom now flowed north to adorn the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. The sons of Nubian chiefs were taken as honored hostages to the Egyptian court in Thebes, where they were educated in the ways of their conquerors. They learned to read and write in hieroglyphs, to worship Egyptian gods like Amun, and to dress and act like Egyptian nobles. The intention was clear: to assimilate the Nubian elite, to turn the children of their enemies into loyal subjects. For a time, the plan worked perfectly. Nubia seemed to become a mirror image of Egypt, a quiet and profitable part of the empire. But in teaching the Nubian princes how to be Egyptian, the pharaohs had unknowingly planted the seeds of a future they could never have imagined. They were teaching their future masters how to rule. For 500 years, this was the reality. Nubia was a well-managed part of a glorious empire, and the great Egyptian machine seemed unstoppable. But empires, like living things, have a lifespan. And as the centuries passed, the once invincible new kingdom began to decay from within. Internal power struggles, corruption, and a series of weak rulers eroded the central authority of the pharaoh. The empire began to fray at the edges. Foreign invaders, the sea peoples, weakened its armies. Eventually, the throne of the pharaohs itself was seized by a dynasty of Libyan chieftains from the north. Egypt, the great unifier, became a fractured land. By the 8th century BC, the country was a chaotic patchwork of petty kingdoms. Warlords and local princes ruled their own territories from city-states in the Nile Delta, often fighting amongst themselves. The spiritual heartland of Upper Egypt, around the ancient capital of Thebes, was governed by a hereditary priesthood who paid little attention to the squabbling kings in the north. The land of the pharaohs had lost its way. The grand temples were neglected, the old traditions were ignored, and the divine order, the concept of Mayat that was the bedrock of Egyptian civilization, had been shattered. While Egypt spiraled into this long twilight, the lands of Nubia to the south were quietly undergoing a profound transformation. The Egyptian withdrawal had left a power vacuum, but it had also left behind a powerful cultural and religious legacy. In the heart of Nubia, near the holy mountain of Jebel Barkal at the Fourth Cataract, a new native power was stirring. Jebel Barkal was a striking, cobra-shaped mountain that the Egyptians themselves had long believed to be the southern home of their most powerful god, Amun. For them, it was a place of immense spiritual power. For the Nubians who now controlled it, it became the epicenter of a revitalized faith. Out of this simmering crucible of Nubian identity and Egyptian faith, a new leader emerged. His name was Alara. We know little about him as a person, but his actions resonate through history. Alara was a Nubian chief who managed to do what no one had done for centuries. He united the disparate clans of Upper Nubia under a single banner. He established his capital at the city of Napata, in the shadow of the holy mountain. But he was more than a warrior and a king. He was a champion of the faith. Alara and his people practiced a form of Egyptian religion that was in some ways more traditional and devout than that of the Egyptians in the north. They saw the chaos and impiety that had consumed their former colonial masters and believed that they, the Kushites, were now the true guardians of Amun's legacy. Alara did not attempt to march on Egypt himself, but he laid all the groundwork. He consolidated his kingdom, built up its wealth, and fostered a powerful sense of destiny among his people. He created a stable and pious kingdom that stood in stark contrast to the divided and secular lands to the north. When Alara died, he was buried with honor, remembered as the patriarch, the founding father of a new dynasty. He had forged a sword and sharpened it. Now it would fall to his brother, Kashta, and his nephew, Piye, to wield it. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable reversals in ancient history. The conquered were about to become the conquerors. The legacy of Alara fell upon his brother, a king named Kashta. His name meant simply, the Kushite, a bold and clear declaration of his identity. Where Alara had consolidated power at home, Kashta looked north. He saw the political vacuum in southern Egypt, the region known as Upper Egypt, and he acted. With the authority of a king and the conviction of a true believer, Kashta led his forces past the first cataract, the traditional border of Egypt. He marched into the ancient religious capital of Thebes, the city of the 100 Gates, the sacred domain of the god Amun. He was not met with spears and arrows, but with acceptance. The powerful priesthood of Amun, who had long governed Thebes as their personal fiefdom, saw in Kashta not a foreign invader, but a powerful and pious champion of their god. They recognized his authority. In a move of profound political and religious significance, Kashta had his daughter, Amenirtis, adopted by the reigning god's wife of Amun, the highest-ranking female priestess in the land. This effectively made his own Kushite daughter the heir to this immensely powerful position, cementing his control over southern Egypt for a generation. Kashta now held Thebes, but he went no further. His great achievement was securing the southern gateway to Egypt. The final audacious step of conquering the entire nation would fall to his son, a man whose name would echo in eternity, Piye. When Piye took the throne in Napata around 747 BC, he inherited a dual kingdom, ruling over Nubia and the southern portion of Egypt. For the first 20 years of his reign, he seemed content with this, focusing on building temples and celebrating religious festivals in his homeland. But in the north, the political situation was growing dangerous. A powerful Libyan prince from the delta city of Sais, a brilliant and ambitious warlord named Tefnakht, was beginning to unite the other northern rulers under his command. He swept south, absorbing city after city, and his ambition was clear: to declare himself the one true pharaoh and reunite Egypt under his own northern dynasty. When word reached Piye in his capital of Napata that Tefnakt's armies were marching south and besieging the city of Heracleopolis, whose ruler remained loyal to Piye, it was the final provocation. This was not just a challenge for territory. It was a personal affront, and, in Piye's eyes, an act of sacrilege against the god Amun. On a monumental granite slab, a victory stele that he would later erect in the temple at Jebel Barkal, Piye recorded his own thoughts, his own words, for all time. He tells us that he laughed with contempt when he heard of Tefnakt's campaign. He saw the northern princes as nothing more than bickering dogs fighting over a bone. For him, the time for waiting was over. The god Amun had called upon him, his true son, to restore order to the sacred land. He did not immediately march north himself. First, he dispatched his commanders already stationed in southern Egypt with precise and chilling instructions, recorded on his stele. He commanded them, "Yoke the best steeds of your stables. Go forth to battle. You know that it is Amun who has sent us." He ordered them to engage Tefnakt's forces, to surround them, to capture their soldiers, their cattle, and their ships. He instructed them to perform a holy ritual before battle, to purify themselves in the river, and to fight not with the rage of brutes, but with the divine fury of heroes. The Kushite army, loyal and disciplined, did exactly as their king commanded. They sailed north and clashed with Tefnakt's coalition, winning a series of victories on both land and water, and driving the northern forces back. But they could not decisively crush the rebellion. Tefnakht, though defeated in battle, remained defiant. Piye realized that if he wanted to truly restore Ma'at, the divine order, he would have to do it himself. At the end of his 20th year as king, Piye assembled a great army and a fleet of ships at his capital of Napata. This was to be no mere military campaign. It was a holy crusade. He made vast offerings to the god Amun at the temple of Jebel Barkal, and before he departed, he gave a speech to his soldiers. He told them that no man could be brave on the battlefield unless he was pure in the eyes of the god. He proclaimed that Amun of Napata was his guide, and that he would return the god to his original home, Amun of Thebes. His timing was perfect. He sailed north, arriving in Thebes just in time to preside over the magnificent Opet festival, the most important religious event of the year. As his grand fleet of Kushite warships docked at the shores of the ancient capital, Piye stepped onto the land not as a conqueror, but as the master of ceremonies. He led the grand procession, where the statue of the god Amun was carried from the temple of Karnak to the temple of Luxor. For the people of Thebes, this was a powerful sight. Here was a king from the south, a man of dark skin and foreign attire, yet he was performing the sacred rites with a piety and grandeur that had not been seen in generations. He was legitimizing his rule not with the sword, but with the blessing of the gods. He was showing them that he was the true pharaoh. After the festival, the holy war began in earnest. Piye's fleet and army continued their relentless advance north. City after city that had allied with Tefnakht now found themselves facing the full might of the Kushite king. Piye laid siege to Hermopolis, the city of the god Thoth, ruled by a king named Nimlot, who had been one of Tefnakt's chief allies. The siege was a masterpiece of ancient warfare. Piye's stele describes it in vivid detail. A great ramp was built to overtop the city walls. Wooden siege towers were erected, from which Kushite archers and slingers rained down a constant volley of projectiles. For days, the assault was relentless. Finally, seeing his cause was hopeless, King Nimlot surrendered. He sent his own wife and daughters to plead for mercy with the queens and princesses in Piye's camp. When Nimlot finally came out to pay homage, he brought with him rich tribute, including a beautiful horse and a sistrum, a sacred rattle used by priests. But it was what Piye did next that revealed his true character. He strode through Nimlot's palace and storerooms, unimpressed by the gold and silver. But when he was taken to the stables and saw that Nimlot's prized horses had been starved during the siege, he exploded with rage. His own words thunder from the stele, "I swear, it is more painful to me that my horses should have starved than any other crime you have committed." In this moment, Piye revealed himself not as a greedy conqueror, but as an aristocrat, a man of noble sensibilities who valued honor and the proper care of fine animals more than treasure. The decisive and dramatic fall of Hermopolis sent a shockwave through the remaining cities of Middle Egypt. One by one, their rulers abandoned Tefnakt's cause and raced to Piye's camp to offer their submission and tribute, hoping to avoid the same fate. The dominoes were falling. Piye was now the undisputed master of southern and Middle Egypt, but the greatest prize and the most formidable challenge still lay ahead. North of his position stood the ancient capital of Memphis, the white-walled city. It was one of the largest and most heavily fortified cities in the ancient world, and inside its walls, the great northern warlord Tefnakht had gathered his remaining forces for a final, desperate stand. Memphis was the heart of northern Egypt. Its massive walls, raised generations earlier, were legendary. The Nile's waters had been diverted to form a moat around its eastern side, and the garrison was strong and well supplied. As Piye's army approached, he found the gates shut and the walls manned with soldiers. His initial calls for a peaceful surrender were met with arrows. The great warlord Tefnakht was inside, and he delivered a fiery speech to the defenders, telling them that the Kushite king's army was strong, but their walls were stronger still. Then, under the cover of darkness, Tefnakht slipped out of the city and rode north into the Nile Delta, promising to return with reinforcements. He had left Memphis to fight to the last man. Piye's first assaults on the walls were repulsed. The city seemed impregnable. He called a council of war with his commanders. Some suggested laying a long siege to starve the city out. Others proposed building great earthen ramps to scale the walls, a tactic that had worked before but would be costly in time and lives against such a fortress. Piye listened, but he rejected their cautious advice. He had a bolder, more brilliant idea. He had observed that the water level was high, bringing the river right up to the city's harbor walls. He saw that the ships in the harbor were moored tightly against the houses and buildings that lined the waterfront. The city's defenders had fortified the main walls, but they had neglected the harbor, their source of life. That, Piye declared, would be their downfall. He devised a plan of stunning audacity, a direct naval assault. He gathered his fleet, including the ships he had captured from his enemies, and lined them up in the harbor. Then, he gave the order to attack. The Kushite soldiers stormed the ships docked in the port, quickly overwhelming their crews. But they did not stop there. Using the captured vessels as scaling ladders, they swarmed from the ship's masts and rigging directly onto the tops of the houses and walls of the city. The defenders, who were all watching the landward side, were taken completely by surprise. Chaos erupted within Memphis as Piye's warriors poured into the city from the waterfront. The battle was fierce but swift. The mighty city of Memphis, the ancient capital of pharaohs for over 1,000 years, had fallen in a single brilliant stroke. Yet again, Piye's actions after the battle were what truly defined him. He did not allow his army to loot the city. His first act as conqueror of Memphis was to post guards at the temple of Ptah, the creator god, to protect it from any harm. He then purified himself and marched in a solemn procession to the temple to make offerings. He behaved exactly as a righteous Egyptian pharaoh should, showing reverence for the gods and protecting the sacred sites. He demonstrated to the people of Memphis that he was not a foreign destroyer, but a pious restorer of tradition. The fall of the white-walled city broke the last vestiges of resistance. The spirit of the Northern Coalition was shattered. The remaining princes and kings of the Delta, including the once proud Tefnakht, sent messengers offering their total submission. They laid their treasures at Piye's feet, promising to be his loyal vassals. Tefnakht himself, humbled and defeated, would not dare to look upon the king's face. He sent a messenger to swear an oath of allegiance in a temple, an oath which Piye accepted. The war was over. Having accomplished his divine mission, Piye, the uniter of the two lands, lord of Nubia and pharaoh of Egypt, ordered all the tribute from the northern kings to be loaded onto his ships. He had defeated his enemies, restored the honor of the god Amun, and forged an empire that stretched from the heartlands of Nubia to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. His work done, he sailed south, returning in triumph to his home in Napata, leaving his commanders to govern the lands he had conquered. He had come not to occupy, but to cleanse and to rule from his ancestral throne, confident that he had fulfilled his destiny. Though Piye had conquered Egypt, he was a Kushite king at heart. After his triumphant campaign, he returned to his capital of Napata and ruled his vast new empire from his ancestral home in Nubia, never again setting foot in the northern lands. His was a reign of oversight, not of occupation. But for the Kushite dynasty to truly take root in the soil of Egypt, it needed a pharaoh who would live among the people, walk the halls of the great temples, and rule from the traditional seats of power. That pharaoh would be Piye's brother, Shabaka. When Shabaka ascended to the throne around 721 BC, he adopted a different strategy. He understood that to command the loyalty of the Egyptians, he had to be one of them. He moved his administration north, making the ancient cities of Memphis and Thebes his royal capitals. He was a constant and visible presence, a pharaoh who ruled not from afar, but from the very heart of the kingdom. His first task was to put an end to the lingering embers of the northern rebellion. The old rival dynasty in the delta city of Sais was still a potential threat. In a decisive and ruthless move to ensure there would be no more challenges to his authority, Shabaka marched into the delta and, according to later histories, captured the last rival king and had him burned alive as a traitor. With this one brutal act, the era of divided rule was over. Egypt was once again a single, unified nation under one undisputed pharaoh. But Shabaka's true legacy was not one of conquest, it was one of restoration. He and the Kushite pharaohs who followed him saw themselves as the saviors of Egyptian culture. They looked back with reverence to the glories of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, a time of colossal pyramids and brilliant art, and they sought to revive that ancient splendor. They saw the preceding centuries of division and foreign rule as a dark age, a time when Egypt's sacred heritage had been neglected and forgotten. Their mission was to bring it back to life. Shabaka's greatest contribution to this mission can still be seen today in the British Museum. It is a large slab of black granite known as the Shabaka stone. On its surface is a copy of an ancient religious text, a creation myth known as the Memphite theology, which proclaims the god Ptah as the creator of all things. According to the inscription, Shabaka discovered the original text on a worm-eaten, decaying roll of papyrus. Horrified that this profound wisdom might be lost forever, he ordered his scribes to inscribe it onto stone, to preserve it for all eternity. This single act perfectly captures the spirit of the 25th dynasty. They were not imposing their own culture upon Egypt. They were acting as passionate archaeologists and preservers, delving into the past to save Egypt's soul from the ravages of time and chaos. All across the land, Shabaka commissioned new construction and the restoration of old monuments. He erected a grand gateway at the Temple of Karnak in Thebes and sponsored building projects in Luxor, Abydos, and Memphis. His reign was the true beginning of the Kushite Golden Age, a period of stability, piety, and a profound reverence for the past. He had solidified his brother's conquest, united the nation, and set a powerful precedent for the pharaohs who would follow. He had proven that a Kushite king could not only rule Egypt, but could also be its greatest champion. Crowned pharaoh around 690 BC, Taharqa came to the throne at a moment of supreme peace and prosperity. His own inscriptions tell us that his reign was blessed by the gods. The Nile River, the lifeblood of both Egypt and Nubia, rose in a series of perfectly timed and bountiful floods, producing bumper harvests year after year. Famine was unknown, and the treasuries of the empire overflowed. This immense wealth gave Taharqa the means to launch the most ambitious building program his dynasty would ever see, one that rivaled the legendary pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Taharqa was a builder on a colossal scale. All along the Nile, from his Nubian heartland to the Nile Delta, new temples, shrines, and monuments rose at his command. In the great religious center of Thebes, he left his mark on the Temple of Karnak, erecting a magnificent kiosk in the main courtyard with 10 massive columns, each one a testament to his power. One of these columns still stands today, a silent monument to his glory. But his efforts were not confined to Egypt. Taharqa poured vast resources into his ancestral homeland of Nubia, transforming it into a religious and architectural marvel. At Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain, he expanded the temple of Amun and carved 2 more temples directly into the rock of the mountain itself. He founded new temple cities at Kawa and Sanam, dedicating them to the gods with lavish endowments, and at the royal burial ground of Nuri he commissioned his own tomb, a pyramid that was the largest ever constructed in Nubia. The Kushite pharaohs had revived the ancient tradition of pyramid building, long abandoned in Egypt, creating smaller, steeper-sided structures that were a unique and powerful symbol of their dynasty's identity. Under Taharqa, the empire was a vibrant, unified, and powerful state. It was a true superpower of the age. Its influence felt far beyond its borders, projecting its power into the Levant and engaging in the high-stakes politics of the Near East. An inscription from his reign proudly proclaims that the empire stretched from the heart of modern-day Sudan to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. For a brief, brilliant moment, the Kushite dream was fully realized. Taharqa was the undisputed master of a renewed and mighty Egyptian-Nubian kingdom, a golden age personified in a single, powerful pharaoh. But history is a turning wheel, and empires that rise to great heights often cast long shadows. Far to the east, across the deserts of Mesopotamia, another empire was on the rise. They were a people forged in the crucible of constant warfare, who worshipped a god of battle and wielded weapons of a new and terrible metal. They were the Assyrians, and their relentless expansion would soon bring them face to face with the pharaoh of the two lands, setting the stage for a clash of empires that would determine the fate of the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was a military superpower unlike anything the world had ever seen. Forged in the harsh lands of northern Mesopotamia, they were a society dedicated to total war. Their armies were vast, disciplined, and equipped with the latest military technology, weapons of hard iron that could shatter the bronze swords and shields of their enemies. Their knowledge of siege warfare was terrifyingly advanced. They used massive battering rams, mobile siege towers, and expert sappers who could undermine the strongest walls. But their most effective weapon was psychological. The Assyrians practiced a state policy of calculated terror. Conquered cities were brutally sacked, their populations massacred or deported to the farthest corners of the empire. Horrific inscriptions and reliefs celebrated their cruelty, sending a clear message to any who would dare resist them: surrender or be annihilated. For decades, the ambitions of Kush and Assyria had been on a collision course. The battleground was the Levant, the collection of small kingdoms and city-states that lay between them. Pharaoh Taharqa, asserting his role as a global power, followed the traditional Egyptian policy of supporting these buffer states, encouraging them to rebel against the ever-expanding Assyrian frontier. He sent advisors, money, and, occasionally, troops to aid kings like Hezekiah of Judah in their defiance. In his youth, as a prince, Taharqa himself had led an army that confronted the legendary Assyrian king Sennacherib. For a time, these proxy wars kept the Assyrian menace at arm's length. But the stalemate shattered with the rise of a new Assyrian king, Esarhaddon. He was a ruthless and determined ruler, and he became obsessed with a single strategic goal: the complete conquest of Egypt. He saw the Kushite pharaoh as a constant thorn in his side, the chief instigator of rebellion in his western territories. To Esarhaddon, conquering Egypt was not just about acquiring its legendary wealth. It was about destroying his main rival and securing his empire's borders once and for all. In 674 BC, Esarhaddon launched his first major invasion. He marched his army across the Sinai Desert, but the attack was a failure. Taharqa's forces met them at the border and repelled them. It was a significant victory for the Kushite king, proving that his empire was no easy prize. But a wounded Assyria was a dangerous beast. 3 years later, in 671 BC, Esarhaddon returned, and this time he came with the full, unstoppable might of the imperial army. The Assyrians had learned from their defeat. They prepared meticulously, using camel caravans to ensure their army was supplied with water as it crossed the brutal Sinai Desert. When they entered Egypt, they were met by Taharqa's army, and a series of ferocious battles erupted. The Kushite and Egyptian soldiers fought with the courage of men defending their homes, but they were outmatched. The iron weapons and disciplined tactics of the Assyrians proved decisive. After 15 days of bloody fighting, Taharqa's forces were broken. The Assyrians advanced on the capital city of Memphis. The battle for the city was a horrific slaughter. Esarhaddon himself boasted of it in his victory records. "I fought daily, without interruption, against Taharqa, king of Egypt and Kush. I struck him 5 times with the point of my javelin, with wounds from which there is no recovery. Memphis, his royal city, in half a day, with mines, tunnels, assaults, I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. In the chaos, Taharqa was wounded and forced to flee the city, abandoning his court and his family. He escaped south, up the Nile, to the safety of Thebes. But the Assyrians captured his queen, his concubines, and his son and heir, Prince Ushanahuru, who were all taken back to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in chains. The Golden Age had ended in blood and fire. The pharaoh was a fugitive in his own kingdom, his capital was a smoldering ruin, and his family was in the hands of the most ruthless empire on earth. Having conquered Memphis, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon believed he had broken the back of the Kushite Empire. He installed a new political order, a classic strategy of divide and rule. He knew he didn't have the manpower to occupy the entirety of Egypt, so he reinstated the local Egyptian princes and warlords in the Nile Delta, the very same dynasts that Piye had humbled a generation earlier. He made them his puppet rulers, bound by oaths of loyalty and overseen by Assyrian garrisons in key cities. His goal was to turn the Egyptians against their Kushite liberators. To commemorate his victory, he commissioned a monumental stone carving, a victory stele. On it, he depicted himself as a giant, holding the captured son of Taharqa on a leash like a dog. It was a calculated, brutal piece of propaganda, a public humiliation designed to declare the end of the Kushite dynasty. But Esarhaddon had underestimated the resilience of Taharqa and the hatred the Egyptians felt for their cruel new masters. The moment the main Assyrian army marched back to Nineveh, Taharqa emerged from the south. From his refuge in Thebes, he rallied his forces and swept north. The Egyptian people, groaning under the weight of Assyrian tribute, rose up in support of him. The puppet rulers of the Delta were quickly overthrown. In a stunning reversal of fortune, Taharqa recaptured Memphis and re-established himself as the one true pharaoh. The Kushite kingdom was reborn. The news of this rebellion reached Assyria just as Esarhaddon died. His throne passed to his son, Ashurbanipal, a man who was both a scholar and a sadist, a collector of books and a master of war. He was even more ruthless than his father, and he would not tolerate such defiance. He immediately dispatched a massive army to Egypt to crush Taharqa once and for all. The clash, when it came, was a repeat of the previous invasion. Taharqa and his loyalists fought bravely, but they could not stand against the full, organized might of the Assyrian Empire. The Kushite army was defeated, and for a second time, Memphis fell into Assyrian hands. This time there would be no swift comeback. Taharqa, now weary from a lifetime of war, was forced into a final, heartbreaking retreat. He abandoned not just Memphis, but also the great southern capital of Thebes, the spiritual heart of his empire. He fled all the way south, past the First Cataract, leaving the land of Egypt forever. He returned to his ancestral home of Napata, a king in exile. The great pharaoh who had presided over a golden age, the builder of magnificent temples, the ruler of an empire that stretched for over 1,000 miles, was now confined to his Nubian homeland. He was defeated, but his spirit was not entirely broken. From his capital in Napata, he could still plot and try to influence events in the north. But he would never again set foot on Egyptian soil. The shadow of Assyria now lay dark and heavy over the entire length of the Nile. From his capital in Napata, the old king Taharqa watched as the empire he had built was dismantled. 2 years after his final retreat, he died and was laid to rest in his great pyramid at Nuri. He was a king who had known the brightest glory and the darkest despair, and his tomb was a final, silent testament to the golden age he had overseen, an age that now felt like a distant memory. His legacy passed to his nephew, Tantameni, a young and proud Kushite king who burned with the desire to reclaim what had been lost. Tantameni's reign began with a powerful vision. On a stele he left behind, he tells us of a dream he had in the first year of his rule. In this dream, he saw 2 great serpents, one on his right hand and one on his left. His advisors interpreted this as a divine prophecy. The 2 serpents were the 2 uraeus cobras worn on the crown of the pharaohs, signifying that he, Tantameni, was destined to rule both the southern land of Nubia and the northern land of Egypt. Believing he had a divine mandate, he gathered his army and marched north to fulfill his destiny. His campaign began with spectacular success. He sailed down the Nile, and the people of southern Egypt, from Elephantine to Thebes, welcomed him as a liberator. He entered the great city of Amun and was crowned as pharaoh with all the ancient ceremony. Emboldened, he continued north, confronted the Assyrian-backed Delta princes, and reconquered the city of Memphis. For a fleeting, brilliant moment, it seemed the dream was real. The Kushite dynasty had returned. But the news of Tantamani's success reached the ears of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. The Assyrian king responded not just with anger, but with a cold, calculated fury. He was determined to end the Kushite problem permanently. He unleashed an army with a single brutal command: march south, and do not stop until the spirit of resistance is utterly extinguished. Tantameni, like his predecessor, knew he could not face the full might of Assyria in a pitched battle. He was forced to abandon Memphis and retreat upriver to make his stand at Thebes. But this time, the Assyrians did not stop at Memphis. They followed him. In 663 BC, the Assyrian army arrived at the gates of the Holy City, the sacred capital of Amun that Piye had come to save nearly a century earlier. What followed was an act of destruction that shocked the ancient world. The Assyrians fell upon Thebes with unparalleled savagery. They smashed their way into the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, which had stood for over 1,000 years. Ashurbanipal himself boasted of the atrocity in his records. "I captured the entire city. Silver, gold, precious stones, the treasures of the palace, colorful clothing, great horses, and the people, male and female. 2 great obelisks covered in shining metal I tore from their bases and carried them to Assyria. They looted the city of its treasures, burned its buildings, and carried off its people into slavery." Thebes, the city of 100 gates, the spiritual heart of Egypt for millennia, was left a desolate, smoking ruin. This was the final fatal blow. The sacking of Thebes was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual annihilation. Tantameni, his dream shattered and his army broken, fled south, back to the safety of Nubia. He was the last of his dynasty to ever set foot in Egypt as its king. The great Kushite adventure, which had begun with a mission to restore piety and order, ended in the rubble and ashes of Egypt's holiest city. The reign of the Black Pharaohs over the land of the Nile was over. The loss of Egypt was a bitter end to a century of imperial glory, but it was not the end of the Kingdom of Kush. The spirit of the dynasty, forged in the fires of conquest and tempered by the tragedy of war, retreated to its Nubian heartland not to die, but to be reborn. The kings returned to their capital at Napata, in the shadow of the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal. For a few more generations, they continued to rule from there, still dreaming of Egypt, still building their pyramids at the royal cemetery of Nuri. But the world had changed. The constant threat from the north, first from the Assyrians, and later from the Persians, and then the Greeks who would come to rule Egypt, made a capital so close to the border a dangerous liability. Slowly, over several generations, the center of gravity of the Kushite kingdom began to shift. It moved south, away from the Egyptian frontier, to a region between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile. Here, nestled in a fertile grassland with more reliable rainfall than the lands to the north, was a city that would become the new heart of the kingdom. Its name was Meroe. The move to Meroe was a masterstroke of geopolitical and economic foresight. The city was strategically located on major trade routes, connecting the African interior with the Red Sea and the wider world. But more importantly, the lands around Meroe were rich with two resources that would define its future: vast forests for fuel and massive deposits of iron ore. The Kushites had learned a hard lesson in their wars against Assyria about the power of iron. Now they had an almost limitless supply. Meroe became one of the greatest industrial centers of the ancient world. Great furnaces burned day and night, smelting the ore. Slag, the waste product of this process, piled up in enormous black mounds that are still visible today, earning Meroe the nickname the Birmingham of ancient Africa. This iron was forged into stronger weapons for their armies and better tools for their farmers, fueling a powerful economy that would last for 1,000 years. With this new southern focus, a new culture began to flourish, one that was uniquely Meroitic. While the Kushites continued to worship some of the old gods like Amun, new deities, like the lion-headed warrior god Apetamak, rose to prominence. The art and architecture evolved, blending Egyptian forms with distinctly African motifs. Perhaps most significantly, they created their own written language. They developed the Meroitic script, an alphabetic system with 23 letters, which had both a formal hieroglyphic form for monuments and a more common cursive form for everyday records. For the first time, the people of Kush were writing in their own tongue. While scholars today can sound out the letters of the script, the Meroitic language itself remains largely undeciphered, a final, fascinating mystery guarding the secrets of this reborn kingdom. In this new Meroitic kingdom, power was often wielded by a line of formidable women. These were the Kandaks, the warrior queens of Kush, who ruled as monarchs in their own right. They commanded armies, directed the construction of temples, and governed a vast and wealthy kingdom with absolute authority. The most famous of these queens was Amanirenas, a one-eyed warrior who, in the 1st century BC, dared to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known, Rome. After the Romans conquered Egypt, they viewed the Kushite kingdom to the south as their next logical prize. They pushed their legions past the old borders and demanded tribute. In response, Amanirenas led her army in a lightning raid north. They sacked Roman forts, drove out their garrisons, and at the city of Syene, they tore down the bronze statues of the Emperor Augustus. In an incredible act of defiance, they carried the severed head of one of these statues back to Meroe, where they buried it beneath the threshold of a temple dedicated to victory. For generations to come, anyone entering the temple would be treading on the face of the Roman emperor. The Romans retaliated with overwhelming force, marching deep into Nubia and sacking Napata. But they found that conquering and holding this vast, fierce kingdom was a bloody and expensive business. Amanirenas and her soldiers waged a relentless guerrilla war. In the end, the mighty Roman Empire was fought to a standstill. They signed a peace treaty with the Kandake, one that was highly favorable to Kush. The Romans withdrew to their original border, and the demand for tribute was removed. The small Kushite kingdom, led by its warrior queen, had faced the masters of the world and had not been broken. For another 300 years, the kingdom of Meroe flourished, a vital link in the trade between Africa, the Mediterranean, and India. But no empire lasts forever. Over centuries, the forests that fueled their iron furnaces were depleted. New trade routes shifted east, bypassing Meroe, and a new, powerful kingdom, Aksum, rose in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia. Around 350 AD, an Aksumite army swept down from the east, sacking the city of Meroe and bringing the final curtain down on more than 2,000 years of Kushite civilization. The story that began in the ancient city of Kerma, that rose to imperial glory with the Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, and that was reborn in the iron-rich city of Meroe, had finally come to an end. For too long, this incredible history has been treated as a mere footnote to the story of Egypt. But the Kingdom of Kush was a civilization of immense power and unique genius in its own right. It was a land of warriors and builders, of scholars and industrialists, of kings who saved Egypt and queens who defied Rome. Their pyramids still stand today, dozens of them, their steep sides piercing the Nubian sky. They are the silent, enduring witnesses to a forgotten African superpower, a kingdom of gold, of iron, and of Black Pharaohs who deserve to be remembered, not as a shadow of another land, but as a brilliant and enduring light all their own.